While I was working on this painting, I was actively thinking about what I would make this video about. What was I focusing on? What was I trying to improve? What does this painting represent? It's Friday night right now. It's the end of my work week, except that I'm driving 6 hours tomorrow to deliver a painting to a client. But I'd like to at least pretend that it's the end of the work week. And I'm trying to figure out whether I can finish this painting in time to make a YouTube video for you from it. So I'm looking at this piece and wondering whether it's done or how close it is to done. And it occurred to me that I haven't really been pushing some of the looseness and expressive brushwork in this painting that I've been striving for, that I said that I'd push toward in this piece. And if you're curious what I'm talking about, I'll link my previous video so that you can hear me talk about what goals I'm working toward right now and how I'm tracking them. So I took a break to mull that over and began making my notes for this voiceover that I'm recording right now. And it occurred to me, I need to play. I could paint a horse with my hands tied behind my back. I could absolutely ruin this painting and still save it. So why am I not taking any chances? So right now, as I write out these notes for you, I'm resolving to play with this piece. I'm pulling up the paintings that are inspiring this piece in terms of the techniques and brushwork they use, and encouraging myself to actively mess some things up and just play. I've been thinking a lot about what's made painting tough for me in the past, and I think a big part of it is simply not feeling like I can just make a mark and see what happens and explore and mess up. I think that last thing about messing up, I think that trips a lot of us up. Painting is such a beautiful process that we often feel it has to be pristine, protected, flawless. And maybe in some cases, or for some artists, it kind of is, but I think that rigidity was creating fear every time I sat down to paint. And it wasn't the kind of fear that made your hair stand on end, but it was the kind that meant that I'd wake up Monday, excited to paint, and somehow make it to Friday without having made anything happen. Does that sound familiar? This actually reminds me a bit of Bob Ross. I was talking to an artist once who is a pretty well-known illustrator, and he commented that he thought Bob Ross was such an underrated artist. He was a fantastic educator, he reached millions of people, and he did a phenomenal amount of work for every single painting you saw him create in real time on his show. In fact, if memory serves, I think he made 3 paintings for every one that you saw as a way to plan the piece and break down how he would teach it on his program. It's sort of funny because only a couple weeks ago, I heard a similarly well-known artist making a joke about Bob Ross. And I just thought how needless it was. After all, Bob Ross popularized a phrase I'm sure all of you know when it comes to painting: happy accidents. This idea that you can choose to be surprised and delighted by a brush mark that you may be tempted to dismiss as a mistake. I think for many of us, we've heard this phrase so much that it's become a bit of a meme, like an idiom whose meaning has been lost because we no longer think about what it actually represents, just how we use it in speech. Like, when is the last time you said you just needed to, quote, bite the bullet and actually pictured yourself doing that? I think that's about how the idea of happy accidents works now. We can toss the phrase around, but how often does it really mean anything to us? So today I want to try and refresh this idea a bit. I want to imagine being truly surprised or delighted by something unexpected in my painting. I want to play and see what happens, and I want to stop being afraid that if I don't do it perfectly, it won't be worth it. So now I'm sitting back down after wrapping up this painting. Of course, you're still seeing it play out in front of you, but I've jumped forward in time. And I have to say, I think it feels better to simply have made something and be curious about what I'll think about it when I come back to the easel tomorrow than to be worrying about making something perfect. Perhaps that sounds a bit obvious, but I think somewhere in my head, I thought that if I sat down to paint and didn't hit it out of the park, that I would feel worse than when I started. This reminds me of a study that Dr. Laurie Santos talks about in her Science of Wellbeing course at Yale, as well as in her podcast. And that is that we are terrible predictors of our own happiness and how we will feel. Whether it's how we would feel 6 months after winning the lottery, or how we would feel 6 months after being in a tragic accident, or simply how we'd feel interacting with a stranger every day. Over and over, psychological research has demonstrated that our conceptions of what would make us happy or what would make us miserable aren't often correct. I'm going to share an example that I think is especially interesting. I hope you do too. So in one study, participants who had a daily subway commute to work were asked to come in and rate how they'd feel if they, 1, had the entire commute to themselves with no interruptions, no engagement with other people. Then 2, how they'd feel if they had a project to work on. Or 3, had to talk to a stranger. Everyone wagered that they feel significantly better if they had time alone, and significantly worse if they had to talk to a stranger. And over, they found the opposite was true. Despite being positive that we would feel worse if we had to talk to a random stranger on our commute, we consistently feel better when it happens. And I think maybe even more interestingly, we actually feel worse when we have time to ourselves, despite believing deep down that we would feel really great after that experience. And I can't help but wonder if something similar isn't happening here. Just like we might avoid interacting with people we don't know, we avoid sitting down to paint and getting our work done. We think that having a hard day of painting will make us miserable, but what if a simple reframing could fix that? Instead of setting a high bar, whatever high bar means for you, what if we just sat down and played? I think it's actually kind of hard to imagine a day of playing at the easel would do anything but bring us joy. So why has this been so elusive? Well, it may not be quite this simple, but I think it is probably still something to really strive for. Sure, some days I'll want to really get some part of a painting right, and I'll be upset if it doesn't happen. But maybe with just enough practice, it can become easier and easier to just sit down and do the work. I've talked with a lot of you who tell me that you just have trouble painting consistently. And trust me, I relate. I don't say just painting consistently lightly, but I think a lot of us feel really baffled by why this is happening. Shouldn't it be that easy? We want to do it after all. I hear that you want a daily practice, but you feel overwhelmed, or maybe you just can't get in the studio and you don't know why. It's taken me a long time of talking through this with students and artists and being curious about what happens in my own mind when I'm having trouble painting to start to figure it out. So I don't think there's a simple solution, but I think the more we start to associate painting with playing, the easier it's going to be to see our way through to the painting practices we're actually wanting. I think a lot about painters who are able to pull up to the easel with the same ease and enthusiasm of people who plop down on the sofa to watch a football game. I thought there must be some magic there, but I wasn't sure what it was. But I did know that I wanted it. That being said, that whole time I was unconsciously thinking that those painters must be sitting down to create a masterpiece, which sounds an awful lot like work, doesn't it? So maybe we're being a bit hard on ourselves. I talk to my students all the time about being scientists in our own journeys as artists, constantly gathering data, being curious, and looking for the hidden variables that we can isolate and adjust to become the painters we want to be. I think there's one interpretation of this idea where we're all at work. After all, that's what being a scientist is, right? We're in the lab, we're analyzing the data, we're working. But what if instead of being scientists, we're like little kids, curious, tinkering, discovering how things work, breaking things? So many of us paint because we want to tap into the joy that art brought us when we were little. I think that's a pretty great thing to aspire to. So perhaps we need to actually make sure our time at the easel aligns with that and give ourselves a night off of working and get in some play. I think that's probably my cue to wrap up this voiceover and wrap up this video so that I can end my workday and get on to some play. If you found this video helpful or resonated with what you needed to hear today, please make sure to give this video a like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon if you haven't already. And until next time, happy painting.